The hall was quiet under the blue light of the twin moons that filtered through the glass panels of the academy ceiling, and Commander Rel sat in his chair with a posture that showed age wisdom and a weight no student in the room could fully understand. His uniform was clean, but worn, the edges frayed, the metals faded, the scars on his arms and face spoke of battles that had been written in history texts but never truly understood. Around him, rows of young alien cadets sat stiff with curiosity, eyes wide and voices hushed. They had read about the war. They had memorized the numbers, studied the formations, and heard stories of conquests. But today, they had been promised something different. Today, they were not learning from a book or a holorecord. Today, they were hearing from the only surviving fleet commander who had stood against the humans and returned alive. Rel's eyes drifted over the class, slowly pausing now and then on a young face that reminded him of someone he once knew, someone long gone. He took a deep breath and finally spoke, his voice gravelly but strong. The silence in the room broke like glass underfoot, and every cadet leaned closer. "You want to know about humans," he said, "but you already think you know what I'll say, that they're dangerous, unpredictable, brutal. You've been told they use strange weapons, that they're smaller than us, that their ships are old, their systems weak, and that their strength lies only in their numbers or in their emotion. But you are wrong." He looked at one of the students directly, a young male with eager eyes, and asked, "What do you believe makes a warrior brave?" The student answered quickly, "Strength, sir, speed, skill with weapons." Rel gave a quiet laugh, a short dry sound, and leaned back in his chair. "We thought the same," he said. "When we first saw their planet, we believed it would fall within days. They had no orbital defenses, their fleet was scattered, their colonies poorly organized, and their leaders emotional, reckless, divided. We believed we were walking into a quick campaign, a cleansing mission. Our orders were to strike hard, strike fast, and take control before they even knew we were there." He paused, remembering the first orders, the cheers of the soldiers, the confidence in their eyes. He remembered the fleet slicing through space, sleek and silent. Like a knife through soft flesh, the alien fleet had descended on Earth's edge colonies with elegance and deadly precision. But then something had happened, something none of them expected. The humans did not run, they did not beg, they did not broadcast surrender messages, they did not send diplomats. They vanished from open terrain. And then they struck, not with force, but with fury. They didn't follow the rules of war as we knew them. They used fire, smoke, acid, gravity, and sound. They used their own planet as a weapon. They let our ships land and then destroyed them from below. I watched my second-in-command burn, alive inside his dropship. Rel said calmly, "I watched our engines collapse under ice storms they created. I watched a team of humans sabotage a weapon array by crawling through a radioactive vent to plant a device that killed them instantly, but disabled one of our dreadnoughts. And they did it with no hesitation." Rel stood slowly and walked toward the massive display at the front of the hall. A glowing map of Earth shimmered under his fingers. He pointed to a valley marked with symbols of past battles. "This is where we lost 300 soldiers in a single night, not to a fleet, not to a missile, but to 12 humans hiding in the cliffs. They attacked at night in silence, used the cold fog as cover, and vanished before we could track them. They knew the land and they turned it into their ally." The students were completely silent, now every breath held as if noise might break the spell of Rel's voice and send the truth scattering like windblown ash. "We called them primitives back then," he said slowly, "but that was our mistake. We thought technology was the measure of strength. We thought discipline was the edge. But the humans taught us that desperation is stronger than fear, and love for one's own kind is sharper than any blade." The first human I saw up close was a soldier. His leg crushed, his face bloody and burned, yet he still fired at us, covering the retreat of his injured team. He refused to let them die alone. We captured him, and even in the cell he stared at us, without fear, without apology. His eyes were full of rage, and something else, something deeper than hate or pride. Rel's hands were tight behind his back, his voice low now, almost a whisper, but still clear. "They fought like they had nothing to lose and everything to Protect. They fought like every death was a promise to fight harder. They fought like their lives were already spent, and they were only borrowing time. One cadet raised his hand uncertain and asked softly, "Sir, if they were so dangerous, how did we win?" Rel turned and faced him, and in that moment, the years fell away from his face, replaced by something cold and tired. "We didn't win," he said. "We survived. We retreated and called it a draw, but in truth, we escaped with what we could and left them in peace because we realized the cost of continuing was too high even for you." Stepped back from the display and looked once more at the stars, visible through the academy roof, his voice now softer than ever. "One day you may face something like them, and when that day comes, remember this: do not measure your enemy by their weapons or size or noise. Measure them by what they fight for and how far they're willing to go when they have nothing left." With that, he turned and walked slowly toward the exit, leaving behind a room full of silent cadets, staring at the map and seeing for the first time not a battlefield but a graveyard of pride and assumptions. The sky above Earth had looked calm that day when the alien fleet arrived, a wide stretch of blue with white clouds hanging still like they had no idea what was coming. The command ship floated high above the atmosphere, engines silent, weapons ready. Thousands of soldiers stood inside the vessel, lined in perfect rose armor, shining eyes, focused minds trained to follow orders without hesitation. And inside the command chamber, Commander Rel stood before the great viewing panel, watching the peaceful planet below with the calm certainty that this campaign would be swift and glorious. Their orders had been simple: strike the human colonies, secure communication points, take control of the resource hubs, and ensure no resistance could form before ground units landed. They had done this many times before on other worlds, and every time their speed and technology had brought quick victories. The High Council believed Earth would be no different. Humans were seen as slow, emotional creatures, ruled by instinct and chaos, lacking discipline or coordination, and for many in the fleet, Earth was not a battlefield, but a stepping stone. Rel, however, had felt something strange in his gut, not fear, but a silence that pressed too hard against his thoughts. The reports he had received had gaps. The satellite scans showed strange heat zones near civilian zones. The human broadcasts were silent, and no surrender signals were being sent out, even as ships began to land across the planet. It was as if the humans had simply vanished. He had sent scout teams to multiple regions expecting to find confused civilians or abandoned buildings, but instead the first 3 teams disappeared. The 4th sent back a broken message full of static, then nothing. When the 5th team reported hostile contact, Rel had leaned closer to the screen, trying to understand what he was seeing. Humans had ambushed them in a narrow canyon. The air was thick with smoke and dust, and every image from the scouts' body cam showed confusion, flames flashing in the dark, strange traps crushing metal vehicles, and human fighters moving like shadows through the dust. They were not retreating. They were luring the aliens in, waiting in silence, using every part of the land to strike without being seen. Rel watched as a heavy walker was dragged into a pit lined with steel spikes. The machine crushed from below, and the soldiers around it panicked, trying to back away, only to be caught in an explosion set off by a single human running through the field with a burning torch. They were not fighting for land or territory. They were fighting for survival, and survival made them something different, something sharper. Rel's command center was thrown into chaos, reports flooding in from different zones. Forests turned into mazes with snipers in the trees, urban ruins filled with hidden bombs, rivers choked with wreckage and bodies. Even their air units were being targeted by primitive ground-based weapons that struck with terrifying precision. It was clear now that the humans had expected the attack, and instead of building high walls, they had built traps. Instead of launching missiles, they had prepared the land itself to become their weapon. A name kept appearing in the intercepted transmissions. Not a code, not a title, just a name. Dean, always followed by coordinates and short commands. Every time this name appeared, an alien squad would fall into a trap, a vehicle would vanish, or a supply route would Collapse Rel began to suspect that Dean was not just a soldier, but a strategist. Someone who understood war in a way that could not be learned in training halls or simulated games. Someone who lived it with fire in the blood and dirt under the nails more than once. Rel ordered his officers to locate and eliminate this Dean. But each attempt ended in silence or failure. The humans were ghosts. They moved without sound, struck without warning, and faded before anyone could trace their path. There was no pattern, no formation, no logic, just fury and instinct, guided by something deeper than orders. It was will, and Rel had seen enough wars to know that will was not something that could be measured by numbers or power. One night he stood before the war map in the command room, watching the blinking lights of his fallen units, wondering how a planet like this could be defeating them, not with strength, but with unpredictability and something else, something that burned through every act of resistance. The humans were not just surviving, they were teaching him, and every lesson came with blood and fire. He remembered a moment clear as crystal, when a group of his soldiers cornered a small group of human fighters. In a tunnel network deep underground, the aliens moved in tight formation, expecting surrender, but the humans lit the tunnel on fire behind them, trapping themselves and their enemies together. When the squad reported the flames and chaos, Rel asked why they would do such a thing, why trap themselves with no way out, and the answer came from one of the survivors: they did not expect to escape. They only wanted to take us with them. That line stayed in Rel's mind long after the tunnel collapsed in. The days that followed the war shifted. The alien commanders started avoiding forests and canyons, started pulling their ships farther from the planet's surface. Even their machines began showing signs of breakdown as humans used weather and terrain to cripple them. Nothing was stable. Every inch of ground had to be won, and even then, it had to be watched, because humans never gave it up completely. Rel started studying human tactics from every source available, listening to their old war recordings, watching ancient footage of their civil conflicts, learning how they thought, how they moved, how they adapted, and every time he learned something new, he felt a strange mix of fear and respect. They had no unifying command, yet they worked together with fluid trust. They had no superior weapons, yet they used everything with deadly intent. They were wounded, exhausted, losing territory, and still they fought as if they were the stronger side. Watched a recording once where a human pilot crashed her ship behind alien lines, and instead of running, she pulled out a flare gun, climbed a destroyed building, and signaled her coordinates. Knowing the enemy would see it too, the flare lit the sky like a dying star, and Rel's forces moved in to capture her. But when they reached the building, it exploded with enough force to tear through a quarter of the block. She had waited there not to escape, but to take down whoever came after her. That was the moment Rel stopped underestimating humans. They were not just defenders. They were hunters with a cause. They were a force that could bleed and break and still crawl forward, and in their pain, there was a strange fire, something ancient, something that whispered, "We will not fall." And every time they lost, they rose again, sharper, harder, angrier. And as the days stretched into weeks and the losses climbed higher, Rel began to understand the war was not about victory anymore. It was about endurance, and he was not sure how long his forces could last against a race that refused to stop breathing, even when buried beneath the ashes of their own cities. Air inside the command chamber had grown colder, not because of failure, but because of silence and weight, the kind of silence that follows when even the proudest commanders no longer believe in easy victory. Commander Rel stood in front of the war board, where blinking red lines had once marked progress. Now they blinked only to show fallen squads and missing ships as officers moved around him, speaking in low voices, their eyes hollow, their movements stiff. They had begun to feel it too, the quiet respect for an enemy they could not understand. Humans had not pushed back in great numbers. They had no powerful ships or swarming forces. They moved like shadows, and every step they took was drenched in smoke and fire. They had no order, and yet somehow they worked together in a way that was not forced. It was instinct. Rel watched them from captured recordings, from drone footage, and from reports given by frightened survivors who described battles that felt more like storms than warfare in one particular region. A wide mountain pass, once believed to be safe for transport, had become a nightmare for Rel's soldiers' machines. Would vanish, then be found burned, and abandoned supply vehicles overturned with no signs of survivors. Large ships caught in netted traps, hanging from the cliffs as if pulled by invisible hands. All of this was the work of one group of humans led by the same name Rel had seen before, Dean. This Dean was not just a soldier, not even a commander by rank, but a leader by presence. Someone whose decisions had turned valleys into war zones and forests into death traps. Rel began to study Dean, not just to defeat him, but to understand him. He saw how Dean chose not the strongest men, but the fastest, the quietest, the ones who knew how to listen to the earth, how to move without being seen. Dean did not build bases, he built opportunities. He turned rubble into walls, smoke into cover, silence into strength, and above all, he protected his people like something sacred. The more Rel observed, the more he felt something changing inside. His thoughts were no longer full of strategies and calculations. They were filled with questions about what kind of people would fight like this. Why would they keep going after such heavy losses? Why did they stay in the fire instead of falling back to save themselves? The answer came not through logic, but through moments that struck deeper than any order or theory. There was a field where an alien patrol had found 3 injured human soldiers, unable to walk, their weapons broken. The alien leader had ordered them to surrender. Instead, the humans dragged themselves into a crater and refused to respond when the aliens moved closer. A 4th human, who had been hiding behind debris, appeared and opened fire, not with hope of winning, but to give the others a chance to fight. Rel watched that footage twice, then a 3rd time, and finally understood they were not afraid to die for each other. Another report showed a young human fighter caught between 2 alien squads, bleeding from a wound in the side. Instead of hiding, she climbed a tower and used her last charge to send a flare high into the sky. When the aliens tried to reach her, the structure exploded and collapsed, taking her and part of the squad with it. The flare had not been for rescue. It had been a signal to warn others to stay away. She had chosen death over capture, not because of pride, but because she was still trying to protect her team, even with her last breath. Rel sat alone in his private quarters. That night, the lights dimmed the air, heavy with the quiet hum of the ship. He stared at the screen in front of him, watching old human broadcasts, not war footage, but clips from before the invasion. Humans laughing, building, running through green fields. Children learning, elders telling stories, small acts of life that now stood in contrast with the fire that covered their world. He realized then they were not fighting for land or pride or even survival. They were fighting for each other, for moments like those, for the right to laugh again, to live again. He thought of his own people, his soldiers, trained from birth, taught to obey, to conquer, to survive through strength and precision. But something was missing, something the humans had shown in every broken battlefield, in every scream and every stand they had no need for orders to protect each other. They did it because their hearts refused anything else. The tide began to shift, not because of numbers, but because of belief. The humans began to strike faster, bolder, hitting fuel depots, communication centers, even the orbital ports. They somehow managed to infiltrate the atmosphere using stolen alien gear, reshaped and patched with their own tools. They sent drones made from scrap metal and explosive arrows crafted from salvaged fuel rods. Nothing looked professional, but everything worked. Rel was forced to abandon 2 major bases in the southern sector, not because they had been destroyed, but because they were no longer defensible. Every approach had become a trap, every landing zone a graveyard. He gave the order with no emotion on his face, but inside a storm was forming. He had never in his long years imagined he would be driven back by what the High Council had once called a lesser race. The turning point came during the siege of the Cradle facility, a key alien stronghold built inside a mountain with armor plating and automated defense. It was thought to be unbreachable for 3 days. Humans surrounded it, not with machines, but with silence they cut off power tunnels, water, and air one by one. And when Rel finally sent a fleet to reinforce the base, the sky filled with fire, a coordinated strike from mountain ridges and hidden artillery tore through the ships. And when the smoke cleared, the cradle was gone, not taken, not captured, gone after. That day, the commanders stopped talking about victory and started asking how to survive. Rel stood before them with a face that carried no pride, only truth. He told them what none of them wanted to hear, that the humans would not stop. They would not surrender, and the longer the war continued, the more his own people would break, not because of defeat in numbers, but because of defeat in spirit. And for the first time since the war began, Rel felt something rare, something heavy. It was not fear, it was respect, because in the heart of fire and dust, the humans had taught him a lesson that could never be unlearned. They had shown him that true strength was not in weapons or numbers, but in the willingness to rise again after every fall, in the unshakable bond between fighters, and the choice to stand not for power, but for each other. The days had turned into weeks, and the war no longer looked like the smooth lines of maps or the steady march of tactics. Now it was fire, smoke, hunger, fear, silence, broken only by sudden explosions or the scream of metal being torn apart. Commander Rel stood at the edge of a shattered command post, his eyes fixed on the horizon where black clouds rose from what had once been an alien landing zone, now reduced to molten earth and scorched sky. The final stronghold was under siege, the last great defense point, the largest facility the alien forces had built since landing, and for many commanders, it was a symbol of pride, carved deep into the rocky cliffs, surrounded by heavy walls and automated turrets with air shields above and mines buried below. It had been built to last, and no one ever thought it could fall. Yet now the humans were closing in, not with massive armies, but with patience, precision, and a terrifying silence that pressed against every wall like an invisible handrail. Had arrived with a personal guard 2 days ago to oversee defense plans, and had watched the situation fall apart in real time. Communication lines failing one by one, drone feeds going dark, movement sensors triggered, and yet no targets in sight. Supply tunnels breached and sealed again, without a trace of who had done it. Everything felt like it was slipping away, and yet there had been no final assault, no announcement of attack, only the waiting, the watching, and the whisper of something building beneath the ground. He stood beside his officers, studying the defense perimeter, when the ground trembled only slightly, but enough to feel it in the feet and bones. Before anyone could speak, the west wall detonated in a wave of fire that blew apart armored panels and crushed one of the main towers. A moment later, artillery rained from the cliffs, but not from ships or large vehicles. It came from hand-assembled weapons, hidden in rocks, fired by human teams that vanished as quickly as they appeared. "Sir, we are losing the perimeter," came the voice of a young officer, but Rel did not respond right away. Instead, he stepped forward, looking through the smoke and dust, and saw them, shadows, moving with impossible speed, using cables and ropes to swing across broken ground. Humans wearing scavenged armor, carrying weapons made from stolen alien tech and repurposed scrap. They moved with purpose, not like raiders, but like wolves taking back stolen ground. He saw one soldier charge through a breach with only a short blade glowing red with heat, striking down 2 guards before being taken by return fire, but not before planting a small device on the wall. Seconds later, the device exploded, taking out half the corridor and making it impossible for reinforcements to reach that section. They knew what they were doing. Every move had meaning, every sacrifice created a new advantage, and Rel realized the attack was not meant to take the stronghold in a single blow. It was meant to bleed it from within, one strike at a time, until the foundation crumbled, not with force, but with exhaustion. In the underground command vaults, officers shouted for backup, but there was no backup to send. The Sky Fleet was already scattered, and the remaining ships in orbit were being drawn into false battles. Human decoys using pulse signatures to lure them away from the surface above them. A human ship appeared out of the cloud cover, flying low and slow, A small freighter, not a war vessel, but clearly modified, its engines roaring with unstable energy. And its path aimed directly at the main power core of the stronghold Rel. Watched in still silence as the ship dove through the anti-air net, ignoring the fire and alarms, its outer shell breaking away as it dropped lower, revealing explosives wrapped in metal and glowing with heat. The ship struck the central tower in a blinding light, followed by a sound that did not echo. It pressed into the air like a wave through water, and then everything shook when the light faded. Half the stronghold was gone, and what remained was burning. Humans poured in from the smoke, firing not for glory, but for each other, covering their wounded, pulling each other from rubble, throwing themselves into danger, without orders, without hesitation. It was not a battle. It was a storm of will, and Rel was standing in the center of it, helpless to stop. Ive gave the order to fall back, not out of fear, but out of knowledge that the stronghold had fallen, not just in structure, but in spirit. The alien forces had nothing left to hold, no reason to stay. Their enemy had proven that ground was not kept by strength alone, but by the blood that soaked it, and the hands that refused to let go. As he left the ruins, he looked back once and saw a human soldier carrying another wounded fighter across the broken bridge with one arm while firing with the other behind them. A group of aliens tried to regroup, but were pinned down by fire from a high ledge where a single human lay flat, holding position alone against a squad. Without flinching that night, Rel sat in the dust among the last remaining command officers, his hands shaking, not from weakness but from something older, something he had not felt in years. He remembered a moment from the early days when he had watched his own people celebrate their first strike, thinking the war would end quickly. And now he saw how wrong they had been. The humans had not only fought back, they had taught him something deeper than tactics, something he could never forget. They had taught him that true fury was not loud or wild, it was quiet. It was the way a hand holds another hand in the dark. The way a voice says, "I won't leave you even when the world is burning." It was not rage for destruction. It was rage for life, for freedom, for each other. When dawn came, the battlefield was still smoldering, but the humans had withdrawn again, vanishing into the terrain, leaving only silence behind and the wreckage of another great symbol. Fallen Rel stood with his officers and said nothing for a long time, until finally he looked up at the sky and whispered, "They do not fight because they want to win. They fight because they refuse to lose." He turned and walked away, his heart no longer filled with the weight of conquest, but with the memory of what he had seen and what he had learned from the enemy, who had shown him more about honor than any training or banner ever had. And though the war was not yet over in that moment, something inside him had ended, something that would never return. Years had passed since the war ended, but for Commander Rel, the memories stayed clear, as if each one had been carved into his mind with fire and stone. He now walked with a slow step through the long halls of the military academy, where young cadets trained under bright lights and wide-open spaces, the kind that had never existed during the war. His body had grown old, his eyes heavier with time, but his voice still held the weight of what he had seen, what he had felt, and what he could never forget. He had been invited to speak again, not by order, but by respect. Every year, the Academy asked him to share lessons from the war, from the campaigns, from the mistakes, from the pain. And every year he stood before a new group of young, eager minds with armor polished and faces full of belief. And every year he told them the same story, not of how they invaded Earth, not of how their fleet had landed with power and glory, but of what came after, of what they had never been taught in their manuals or their training halls. He stood at the center of the hall once more, the tall windows showing a sky filled with calm stars, far different from the skies he had known during the campaign. His voice echoed softly as he looked at the row of young cadets and began the story of the final days. The days when the war did not end in victory or defeat, but in understanding and quiet silence. When the stronghold fell, he said, we had lost more than ground. We had lost the illusion that we were untouchable. We had always believed our technology and strategy would win every battle, But humans taught us that battle is not just what happens on the field, it is what happens in the heart, in the fire, behind the eyes, in the reason someone chooses to stand instead of run. The cadets listened with full attention, leaning slightly forward as Rel described how the remaining alien forces had retreated from Earth, not under command, not by strategy, but by survival. They pulled back because there was nothing left to take. Every inch of soil was soaked in human defiance, every mountain echoing with the sound of resistance, and even the skies themselves no longer felt safe. Our leaders asked us to push again, to reorganize and strike with more force. But I told them no. Rel said, not because I had given up, but because I had seen enough. I had seen what kind of people we were fighting, and I knew we would only bring ruin to ourselves if we kept going. They would never stop. They would keep fighting, even with nothing, even with no food or shelter, even if the whole planet burned. They would keep standing as long as one of them could still breathe. Was silence in the room, the kind that comes not from boredom or distraction, but from a deep listening, the kind that meant the words were being carried far beyond the walls of the hall, into the minds and maybe even the hearts of those who sat and watched the old commander speak. Rel reached into his uniform and slowly pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. When he unfolded it, a simple human medal rested in his palm, dented, scratched, and stained with the passage of time. I took this from the ruins of a battlefield, he said, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. This was not the award of a general or a hero. It belonged to a scout barely 20 cycles old, who held a hill alone against 5 of our units until airstrike forced us back. When we found the hill again, he was gone, and so was half our squad. He placed the medal on the desk in front of him and stepped back, watching the young eyes study it, not with mockery, but with stillness and awe, because they knew it was not just metal, it was memory, it was meaning, it was the proof of something greater than firepower or ranks. One cadet finally raised his voice, not with challenge, but with quiet curiosity. Sir, if we ever fight them again, would we win? And Rel looked at him, not with anger or pride, but with calm understanding. He said, you cannot win against those who have already accepted the price of victory. You can only hope to walk away before the cost becomes too much to bear. He turned and walked slowly down the rows of cadets, and each one moved aside without being told, their eyes following him like shadows trailing light. And as he reached the doorway, he stopped and spoke once more without turning. I do not fear humans anymore. I fear the day we forget what they taught us. Later that night, as the stars began to rise over the academy, Rel sat alone on a bench outside, looking into the vast black sky. Where once fire had reigned and ships had fallen, now there was peace. But peace had not come from dominance or surrender. It had come from something deeper, the kind of peace that is built not by weapons, but by the hard knowledge of what war truly costs. He remembered the final broadcast sent by the human resistance before all communication ceased, not a threat, not a demand, but a message that said, we will not kneel, we will not run, we will not be forgotten. And Rel knew they never would be, because they had written themselves into history, not with grand machines, but with the blood of those who never backed down. In the end, it was not the alien victories that shaped the future. It was the human defiance that forced change. It was their fierce tactics, their unity under pressure, their choice to fight not for conquest but for survival and for each other, that changed how wars were studied, how leaders were trained, and how enemies were seen. As Rel closed his eyes under the calm sky, a breeze brushed his face, soft and cool, not like the fire winds of war, and in that quiet breath he whispered the words he never shared with anyone else, the words he had once heard on a battlefield, spoken by a dying human soldier who smiled through the blood and said, tell them we stood tall. Rel would tell them again and again, not because he owed it to the humans, but because he owed it to truth. And in that truth, there was a lesson that would live long after his voice was gone, because some stories are not told to honor the past, but to protect the future. The end.